Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the film Beetlejuice Beetlejuice, and we are joined by a very special guest, a friend of the pod. You've heard her here on the pod in the past for our Doom 2 episode. Alexis is back. Alexis, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Alexis. I'm the editor of Trashwire.com, and you can find me all over the place, giving my quick reviews of movies on TikTok and Instagram and stuff like that, trying to give all the information in, I would say 60 seconds or less, but in reality, it's more like 90 seconds or less.
Love it. Well, we're so excited to have you back. This is going to be a fun conversation, I'm sure, about this film. So, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for Beetlejuice Beetlejuice?
After a family tragedy, 3 generations of the Dietz family return home to Winter River. Still haunted by Beetlejuice, Lydia's life is turned upside down when her teenage daughter, Astrid, accidentally opens the portal to the afterlife.
All right. And in Movies in Us tradition, we love to start off with our one-sentence summaries for the film that we're going to be covering. So, Alexis, as our guest, would you like to share your one-sentence summary for Beetlejuice Beetlejuice first?
Sure. So mine is kind of inspired by the use of the song MacArthur Park in this movie. And I went with, we may want another slice of nostalgia, but we'll never have that recipe again.
Nice. Oh my gosh. Well done. Well done. I am now intrigued to hear your thoughts about this film after that one sentence summary. Let me tell you. Sarah, what is your one sentence summary for Beetlejuice Beetlejuice?
Mine is an escalating series of relationship red flags.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot in here. My one sentence summary is moms do know best.
Nice. Yes, they do.
Okay, well, let's dive in and share our thoughts about this sequel to the original Beetlejuice. In this first section, we will keep our thoughts at a high level and just kind of share our overall feelings about the movie, which I'm sure we have feelings about this one. So, Alexis, with that spicy one-sentence summary, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this film. Did this work for you? And I believe you're a fan of the original, so
I do love the original.
A slice of nostalgia served on a plate for you. Did it work for you?
I think for me, it's I have like such love for the original. It's one of those movies. I just find it so creative and different, and it was kind of like subversive, but in a way that like PG movies could be subversive in the 80s and stuff. So I really love that movie. And I think for me, there were parts of this that I liked. There were little hints of kind of like, oh, okay, that's giving me a little bit of what I had before. But overall, I think I said in my review that it feels a little bit more like Hocus Pocus than like a Beetlejuice movie to me. And that was where I was like, oh no, it's kind of become the kind of generic Lego-sequel thing that I didn't want it to be. So I didn't love it.
And we're going to dive into the pieces that worked and perhaps the pieces that really didn't work in more specifics soon. So I'm intrigued to hear which of those pieces really stood out to you a lot in this film. Sarah, I'm curious your thoughts about Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. Did this slice of nostalgia work for you or not?
Yeah, I feel very similarly to Alexis. Especially after rewatching the first film very recently, I was so excited for this sequel, and I was like, man, maybe they can pull it off, because you got Tim Burton coming back, you have a lot of the principal cast coming back. Like, wow, is this going to be one of those rare sequels that lives up to the original? And it doesn't. I think this movie is fine, but I think that it's overstuffed. There's too many plot lines. There's just too much going on. And for me, it wasn't as funny as the original either. So while I appreciated some of the ways that it incorporates, those nostalgic bits, and there are some really creative moments that I thought were fun, it just doesn't hold a candle for me to that first film that, like you were saying, Alexis, it's so unique and creative. And this, I don't know, I did leave kind of feeling disappointed after watching this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take us 3 for 3 here. I think that this feels like a safer, toned down, more vanilla version of the first movie, and what it needed to do is really continue with that zaniness and really swing for it, And I think this film just it feels like it played it very safe, both in the plot line, but also in some of the visuals, in the humor, in the jokes. I think the first movie has such like pop and pizzazz, and this one just it felt like we were kind of going down memory lane, but without the same energy and that zany nature that I think is like what makes the first movie so endearing and so beloved. I had some challenges getting on board with this film in the first hour because the characters were really hard to love and hard to follow. And that felt like such a contrast to the first movie where we immediately fall in love with the Maitlands and we're on board. We're rooting for them. They've got this little mission that they're trying to figure out how to get these new foreigners in their home out. And we're kind of invested in that. And so even before all of the craziness with Beetlejuice shows up in this movie, I just found myself like really struggling to connect with these characters that are so flawed. And I think Sarah, you mentioned relationship red flags all around everywhere. And so that was hard for me to like continue to follow them until we get to the like last 30 minutes of the film. And then the other thing that I was really hoping for and missing was the visuals around the sets. The first movie, the set design is so incredible. And I think there's maybe like hints of that in this movie, but definitely leaves a lot to be desired. There's some interesting like visual styles that I think this movie is playing with in these like little segments that kind of interrupt the main plot that I think we can talk a little bit about. I'm curious both of your thoughts about those that seem to be more creative and interesting, but I think on the whole, just a lesser version of the first, and just it needed to go big and swing for the fences, and it really didn't.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree. I think it's kind of like if you have the sort of original Coca-Cola with like real sugar and then later you have a Diet Coke and you're like, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a Coca-Cola, but it's just not a Coca-Cola. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not that OG real sugar, like full calories, rot your teeth Coca-Cola. It's just kind of like an imitation of the Coca-Cola that you want.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a problem that a lot of sequels fall into that category. Especially sequels of pieces that were so beloved. It's hard to recreate that magic again. And I think I would like have preferred for this movie and in general the sequels of beloved films, first films, to just at least do something different, do something innovative. Like even if it's wrong and it doesn't capture the magic of the first movie, it had a vision and direction somewhere. Whereas to your point, I think Beetlejuice feels like a just toned down, less saturated, less colorful version of the first one. And I would have preferred a highly saturated version that is maybe really different from the first one, that some people love, some people hate, but there's something maybe like interesting to talk about. And when it's polarizing for the masses, there's something interesting there. I'm like, why did this work for some people and not for others? Very The Last Jedi-esque in the Star Wars universe, but at least there was vision, and I think that's where Beetlejuice is just missing. It's just a toned down, more vanilla version of the first one. I would argue that there's some like visual pieces in those visual styles that perhaps it's playing with something and has a vision for that we can chat about. But on the whole, yeah, definitely Diet Coke to the original Coca-Cola.
Totally. Yeah, it's a very sort of safe, it feels like Beetlejuice with all the edges sanded off in a lot of ways. And I think what's so great about the original Beetlejuice is that it's weird, it's kind of like, it doesn't feel like a super mainstream movie. And like, it's a family friendly movie without being like sort of like dumbed down in any way. Whereas this felt a lot like, you know, okay, well, this is going to work for this audience and this is going to work for this audience. It was like you could feel kind of like the focus groupification of this story. And I think that was so disappointing when the original feels like such a cool, you know, unique vision, to have something that just kind of feels like, well, it's a studio product, you know, and it's a little bit better. It's got a little more visual flair than your average studio product, but as far as like screenplay wise, it's like, oh, it's just kind of a studio product.
And I think, Sarah, you bring up a really great point, which is the humor and how that is so different from the first film. And to your point, Alexis, figuring out how to do humor today is a challenge, but when it does go fully into its vision and its character and its flair, it kind of, the movie like begs you to come along with it, you know, and it just it asks you to come, and if you're willing to, you're gonna have the time of your life, and if you're not, the movie kind of doesn't care, you know, for the first one. And I think Beetlejuice definitely feels like it's playing to the masses in its style of humor as well, whereas I think the original was just like, if you're on board, great, like come along, and if not, sorry, you're missing out, you know. And this one is I think trying to be palatable or appealing for a larger audience, which maybe is kind of its fatal flaw because it's shooting itself in the foot. We can get on board with something that has a sense of self, and this one perhaps is trying to be everything to everyone. But
definitely,
yeah, I'm curious, Sarah, your thoughts around the humor specifically, because I think you mentioned that in your initial thoughts about this movie.
Yeah, I'm curious about y'all's theater going experiences too. There were a few times when like I laughed at certain parts of this, but for the most part, and I did go see this on a Monday morning, so like there weren't a lot of people in my theater. There was maybe 4 other people, but I didn't hear any other laughter from anyone. So I don't think that the people in my theater were having a very good time, which is a real shame because the first film, like even me sitting alone on my couch watching it on my TV, I was laughing out loud at the first one. There's so many funny moments. And I think the premise of the first one is just hilarious because you have these 2 regular people who become ghosts and they're stuck in their house and a family moves in and starts changing their house. That is a hilarious setup. It's so good. There's so many directions you can go. And the newbie ghosts, they don't know how to ghost. So they're struggling and they're trying things and they don't know what to do. And so I think all of that is just a great setup for comedy. And then you add Michael Keaton's unhinged performance on top of that. And it just makes for a hilarious mix of all of these different types of humor. And I feel like in the sequel, it's, I love what you said about it being focus grouped. Like it feels like that. It's almost like, okay, we have this character who's going to have this type of humor and is going to get this much screen time so that these parts are funny for this select group of people. And then we're gonna have this person who has a different type of humor. And like, I don't know, it just feels like there's this like strategy to it, but almost not in a good way. And so I think a lot of the humor for me didn't work. I really hate it in movies when you can tell that like a line or something is supposed to generate laughs.
Yes.
And then it doesn't.
The pause for applause. There was like a hold for applause every joke. And I'm the same. In my theater, people were not laughing either. So it was like a pause where you're like, ooh, crickets, like yikes, you know?
Yeah, that's never a good sign. Yeah. And so I think, yeah, I don't know, this didn't work for me. Did the humor work for you guys at all? Or I don't know, were there certain parts that you found more humorous than others?
Yeah, it fell really flat for me as well. I think it was, you know, you can like tell that Michael Keaton is riffing a lot in the first movie, and there's some really great little things that he puts in there that you can just feel like, because he's such a talented comedic actor, and I think like he really brings a lot to it. I think about like the sequence where he's, Alec Baldwin asks him, like, well, what are your qualifications? And he sort of launches into this, well, I attended Juilliard,
Yes.
and then he does the, I've seen The Exorcist 167 times, like all the stuff. Like there's so many great moments of delivery in there. And I feel like it was much more like a generic kind of, here's a punchline, here's a setup, just sort of just the jokes just felt so much less like creative to me. It was much more like, this is going to appeal to the broadest possible audience versus like, we're just going to let Keaton riff and we're going to let him deliver things in the way that, he knows how to do best. And we're just going to kind of like let him be this guy. Because Beetlejuice is like sleazy in the first movie, he's not like a family friendly, like your buddy, your friendly ghost. Like he's gross. He's like, he's rude. He's not like a good guy. So I think in a way it's like, this felt more in line with like the Beetlejuice animated series than it did with the Beetlejuice movie. It was like, oh, the movie Beetlejuice is a lot edgier. And then when they made it sort of a series for kids, this feels like in that vein more than in line with the first movie, I think.
Which actually begs an interesting question of like, in their focus group research, like what is the target market that they're thinking about? And is it for audiences that are maybe younger, and so the jokes need to be palatable and appealing and to them, it's because there's I don't, and I could be like misremembering, but there was a lot more like spicy, like slightly more inappropriate jokes in the first movie, and I kept like kind of like waiting for them in this movie, and again, the movie plays it pretty safe, so we actually don't really get a lot of those. And in the first movie there's a lot that's suggestive without being in a like blatantly inappropriate, but it's there and the insinuation is there, and I think that makes for a punchy, edgier character as well, whereas he's more like clown-like in this movie, versus having that like that edginess and that pizzazz that is arguably something that for like especially like older audiences can draw you in. You can get on board and kind of like go along with his shenanigans, as terrible and rude as they may be, but like you kind of love seeing him just like be him. And in this movie he feels more like a polished clown, for lack of a better phrase.
For sure.
Yeah. And I wonder if that space for riffing, I don't know, maybe there was like a lot more that had to be pre-written or constructed and thoughtful beforehand in order to for filming. I don't know what that might have looked like, but
yeah, this just feels way more sort of structured, and kind of like you can kind of feel the kind of like corporateness about it. I think maybe too, in the 80s you could have a movie that was like available to kids, but it didn't have to just be for kids. I think about stuff like Ghostbusters. I think about Gremlins. Like both of those movies have jokes that would be probably inappropriate for kids nowadays, but as a kid, I remember liking those movies. Like I loved Ghostbusters when I was a kid. And then when I watch it as an adult, there's jokes in there that I'm like, clearly that went over my head as a kid. But if you were an adult and you did take your kid to that movie, you weren't going to be bored out of your mind because there was also stuff in there for you. And I think that was just kind of something that could happen in the 80s that we just don't really have that much anymore. It's like, it's either a movie that is like kind of for kids, or it's a movie that's like a drama for adults, and you don't really get that kind of like subversiveness in a movie that is also accessible to kids. This felt much more like a kid's movie to me than the original Beetlejuice, which I remember loving as a kid, but doesn't necessarily feel like a kid's movie, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I definitely felt similarly to that. It's so funny. You bring up a good point about those 80s movies, because I also grew up watching those and I loved them as a kid too, which now going back and watching them as an adult, I'm like, wow, how was I allowed to watch this? But I think that just for the sequel, it just speaks to that kind of safety that we've been talking about. Is it's not really pushing those same boundaries. It's not pushing those same buttons. It's just kind of like, okay, we have this I don't know, nostalgic thing.
Mm-hmm.
Here, watch this. And I wonder if some of the like structuredness of this movie uh, has something to do with the sheer number of characters and plot lines in this.
Yes.
And so they didn't have the space or the time for that creativity and flexibility because so much was stuffed into this. Whereas the original movie is very, very simple
Mm-hmm.
plot wise. And so then that allows for a more complex like world building and allowing the characters to just kind of be silly and fun and all of these things because it's so simple.
Mm-hmm.
But the sequel has a lot going on, so they maybe didn't have time for all of that fun stuff that we loved in the original.
Totally agree. I mean, to call it bloated is an understatement. It's like there are like 47 characters in here and everybody has their own little plot line going on. I was like, this isn't even like an A plot and a B plot. We're getting into like, JKL plots here. It just keeps rolling along, and it's like it's frustrating because it's so unnecessary. I mean, the great part about the first movie, like you said, it's basically like these people that are dead, someone's going to ruin their house, and they're just trying to figure out how to be ghosts and how to sort of get these people to not ruin their house. It's so simple. And with this, it's like, oh, there's 37 different plot lines, and we've got a jilted ex-lover, we've got a detective, we've got this teenage romance, we've got this TV producer, and there's just way too many things going on. I think this movie would have been so much better if it was like, okay, it's Lydia, it's Delia, it's Beetlejuice, like, great. That's all we really need. You don't need 1,000 different storylines going on. You can streamline this and then like give us the characters we really care about, because you don't really get to spend enough time with anybody to care about them. And the people that we do care about, we care about because we got to know them in the first movie. So it's way too filled with storylines, and it just means that none of the storylines really get a chance to bloom in any type of, satisfying way.
This is probably the perfect time for us to include a spoiler alert so that we can talk about some of those different plot lines and how they shake out. So if you haven't seen Beetlejuice, this is your spoiler alert. Please check it out before listening to the rest of this episode so that you go into this movie with a truly white canvas. Okay, so we have full free reign now to talk about all of the different plot lines. The one that I think is the most unnecessary is the whole jilted ex-lover, soul sucker lady that there's some like, I think like interesting like little segments that we get visually where she's, doing her soul sucking and like all of the way that the body parts like become deflated, or like her gathering her parts together and like stapling them together. There's some cool stuff that they do there. I think each of them kind of lasts a little bit too long. But Homegirl shows up at the beginning of the movie. We get like a whole middle section of like 45 minutes where she's nowhere to be seen. And by the time we get to the last 30 minutes, I high-key forgot that this is a whole storyline that needed to be resolved. So when she shows up, I was like, I forgot about you. That's right. You had a whole mission going on too. And then Willem Dafoe is just like randomly thrown in there as the cop that's also hunting.
Yes.
That's a whole storyline that I literally forgot when we got to the final climactic sequence. And I was like, oh yeah, you're back. Okay, I remember you.
Completely agree. Yeah, her storyline is so unnecessary. And it's like, again, what is the focus of this movie? And it's like, we just don't really know, because we also want to have this. Like, I don't need a backstory for Beetlejuice. I don't need to know what his life was like before. We don't need to Han Solo this. I don't need to be like, Han by yourself, Han Solo. I don't need that for Beetlejuice. It's good. Like, it's fine. I don't need the Beetlejuice lore. It's fine. Like, so it just feels so like, if anything, it takes away from that character to be like, here's this flashback and here's this, ex-wife that he had. And she looks gorgeous. I think it's like, that could be really interesting, but it's like, why is this in here? And then Willem Dafoe, who I love, and I think is doing what he can with this, but that's another character where it's like, so she's tracking down Beetlejuice and then Willem Dafoe's tracking down her, but then why? Because we already have all this other stuff going on. It's just so unnecessary. And every time she's on screen, you're just like, oh yeah, that's a thing we're doing. I forgot about that. it reminded me of in the sequel to The Mummy, how you go through the whole movie and then you go, oh yeah, that's right, The Rock is in this. Like, it's like,
Yes.
oh yeah, The Rock is in this movie. I forgot about that, because it's completely unnecessary for him to even be in it.
Well, and it was funny. So the way that Dolores is introduced just annoyed the crap out of me when I was in the theater. So you're sitting there and you're watching, and we are introduced to this French artist that Delia has upset, and he dies. And like immediately. And I was like, oh, okay. So we're going to follow him a little bit, learn a little bit more about the afterlife. This is super cool. No, he only exists to bump into Danny DeVito mopping the floor.
Yep.
And then I was like, oh, cool. Danny DeVito is in this. That's really cool. I wonder what ghost Danny DeVito is going to be like. Do we learn? No, because he purely exists to introduce us to Homegirl because for some reason his device electrocutes the boxes that her body parts are in. Sure, okay. And I was like, did we really need to introduce two other unnecessary characters to get us to this unnecessary character?
Completely agree.
What are we doing? Oh, I was so frustrated.
Wouldn't Danny DeVito have been so much more fun if he was like an afterlife bureaucrat, like standing in the way of all these things? I love Danny DeVito. I love Danny DeVito in a Tim Burton movie where he's like dripping stuff out of his mouth. I'm like, oh my God, it's giving me Penguin flashbacks. I'm loving that. But then it's like, oh, we just waste him. Never mind. It's like, like I get that it's just a little cameo and kind of a little like, hey, look, Danny DeVito's in this. But I just kept picturing like, wouldn't he have been so great if he was like, just someone that was standing in the way with all this bureaucratic nonsense that we see in the afterlife, and he's like a problem for whoever it is that's in the afterlife and trying to fix something. I was like, oh man, I wish he could have been used in a different way in this.
Oh, that would have been so much fun. Like, there's so many fun ways that you can utilize Danny DeVito in this movie.
Right?
Like, almost any other choice would have been excellent.
Exactly.
Like, I can think of so many other ways that he could contribute positively to this, and they chose the worst option. And that's just so frustrating.
It's so true.
Well, it also highlights, to your point earlier, around how like so much of the plot is like stitched together in these ways that kind of don't make sense. So the one that like I was like, what are we doing here? So Astrid leaves the funeral, goes on her little bike ride, almost crashes, crashes conveniently at the foot of the tree of the dude, and then they trauma bond. And I'm like, what is going on? Like the characters make choices that don't make sense, or they meet other characters that you then understand obviously will push the plot forward in some meaningful way. But it's like it doesn't pass the smell test, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so it's hard for us to like really invest, because we're like, no, I can see the seams here, you know, like the fabric is being held together, but the seams are really showing. And I think that kind of begins to degrade the trust that we have in the movie to really take us home.
Completely agree. That's such a good way to put it, because that really is what it is. It's like, you know, the first movie, I feel like you just sort of see the tapestry of this cool thing that they've made. But with this, it's like you can really see the production of this. You can really see the kind of calculations. You can see all that sort of behind the scenes strategy way more than in the previous movie. Like you could see where they're trying to appeal to several different audiences, or where it's kind of like, well, we have to have a teen storyline in there, so let's have this, and how about we have this thing going. It's like you just kind of can see all that. And I think completely agree on characters that are making decisions that just don't feel like they make any sense. I felt like that big time with Lydia, where it was like, okay, we see Lydia, we know Lydia from the first movie, and now she's like, hi, I'm a charlatan on TV, and this guy's my boyfriend for some reason, even though this doesn't seem like a person I would be interested in at all. And okay, whatever. It's like, what? Lydia? Like, this doesn't feel like Lydia from before, and there's no real explanation of how we got there. So it's like, cool, if you want to make her totally different, like maybe tell me why she would be totally different. But it's just like everybody just keeps making decisions to further the plot rather than a decision that feels like it would be natural to that character. And it's so frustrating.
Yeah, they really did Lydia's character dirty, man. I'm like, she was so badass in the first movie. You know, she had like a mind of her own.
Totally.
She advocated for things that she cared about. She's got pop and pizzazz. This movie, she is just like at the feet of this man, just like waiting for him to love her and accepting this like weird form of love, which like she clearly can see, but like it's still choosing. And so it goes back to how the premise of the first movie was so simple and so funny, but also like we're rooting for those characters for the first hour 20. And in this one, I'm just scratching my head at every decision every character's making. And I think that the other problem is that they aren't lovable the same way that they were in the first movie. Like theoretically, we should have every reason to be rooting for Lydia. But I'm like, why are you making these decisions, homegirl? You know, like, and so then it's harder for us to like really continue to invest in her because I'm just frustrated with her the whole time. I'm like her friend that's like wanting to shake her to be like, get out of that relationship, girl. Like he is no good for you.
Completely. Nothing about Lydia seems like she would like that guy. You know what I mean? She wouldn't like, nothing we know of Lydia seems like she would be interested in that guy in any way. And it's the Lydia we know would be able to completely see through that guy's little scheming immediately. So it's just like, who is this? Why is she like this? This movie is missing the Maitlands. It's missing those kind of characters that we care about, that have a heart, that we are invested in their story, because really like they're the main characters of the first movie. And then everybody else is kind of there for sort of color. But with this, it's like, okay, well, who is the main character of this? Because if it's Lydia, I don't know who this Lydia is. And then it's not really Beetlejuice. And then it's not really Astrid. And it's not really Delia. It's like, who is the main character of this movie?
And I think the other thing that frustrated me about Lydia was that the attempted explanation for her being a completely different character was essentially trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's such a lazy cop-out. Like, are you kidding me? You're not going to give us any depth or meat there. You're not going to think this through or give us, I don't know, anything to latch onto. It's just, oh, she suffered a trauma and that's it. And now she's totally different.
She suffered a trauma. Her personality's the opposite now. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, we got a plot to get through. Like, don't get hung up on that detail.
We got 1,600 other characters we've got to explore here.
So one of the things that this movie does do is play with visual style a little bit. We've got a claymation kind of animated looking segment for the backstory explanation of how Lydia's dad dies from Delia, I believe, is the one who's telling that story. And then we get a whole sequence with Beetlejuice's origin story that no one was looking for. I'm curious your thoughts on, like, there's a clear, like, visual style difference that the movie's playing with. Did that work for you? Was it interesting? Were you intrigued? Were you surprised? Was it jarring? What are your thoughts about this kind of little detours, little side quests that we take?
I liked the sort of stop motion bits. I think, to me, like, Tim Burton, I always think of as such like a visual storyteller. And I mean, like, most of my favorite Tim Burton things are kind of before he like discovered CGI, which I feel like is maybe not the best thing for him. So I think like those aspects of it, even something like the sandworms, you know, like I like that kind of old school Tim Burton-y feel. I think this sort of Beetlejuice backstory, like I get what they were going for, but it felt sort of unnecessary, and it was in that kind of vein of like too safe. Like I think that could have been done in a really interesting visual way with like something that just felt a little more kind of gothic, or a little more like German expressionist, or a little more in that old school Tim Burton kind of style. It just felt very like, and what if he has this, you know, origin story that's like in Italian and black and white or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, whatever. But like, this could have been done. I mean, first of all, it's unnecessary, but if we have to do it, I think it would have been cool to do that in a more like hyper stylized way. But I will say, as far as like these kind of legacy sequel things go, I do appreciate that there was at least a little bit of visual style in this, because these movies can be so generic that it was like, oh, at least we have some weird kind of black and white stuff and some bizarro architecture, like that afterlife world. I was like, oh, this has shades of the original in there, which I still think the original looks better. But it's like, oh, okay, at least we get a little something interesting from this visually.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I wanted more, and maybe my expectations were just wrong. Maybe I'm part of the problem. But the first one, like we've been talking about, it feels so fresh and so unique. And I think I just wanted more of that in the sequel. And like, it's cool. Claymation, cool. Not mad at it. Like I appreciate that, like the sandworms still look like the sandworms that we're used to, so like I did appreciate those things. But I think, to your point, Alexis, I just wanted, I think I wanted this film to be not safe. I wanted it to be daring. I wanted it to push the boundaries, which I feel like the first one does. And this just kind of doesn't. But I did appreciate that Charles has half of his body is just missing the whole movie. That's probably like one of my favorite choices in this, is that we're following this like half of a character as he's just wandering around. So it was things like that where I was like, oh, that's really good, that's creative, that's funny, seeing these random extras in the afterlife and seeing how they died, that's really interesting and funny. So there's these little moments where I was like, oh, that's brilliant. But I think I just, as the theme with this entire episode seems to be, I wanted more from even the visuals.
Yeah. Well, there's so much. I mean, when you think about that kind of like a waiting room in the afterlife in the first movie, I mean, there's like the woman that's like the receptionist. She's like, had I known what I knew, I wouldn't have had my little accident. Like that's so much more subversive than we would get in this.
Yes.
And so it's like, I appreciated that they had the like, shark bitten Charles. Like I thought that was good. It's a creative way to solve a problem with this actor, because you can't bring him back.
Yes,
so it was
absolutely.
like, okay, this is a very creative way to do that. And it is sort of weird and sort of subversive that you have this kind of half a torso of a man that's like spurting blood, and it's like, it's gross, it's interesting, it's a little subversive, but it was like, there was just so much more to, like, when you look at that first movie, just the sort of view of the afterlife, there's like dudes with nooses around their necks that are like sort of carrying papers back and forth through the office. There's like the guy that's like smoking a cigarette that's like burnt to a cinder. Like there's all these things where it's like, ooh, that's like way edgier than what you would get in this. And even that doesn't feel like edgy enough to like alienate an audience. That's like fun edgy. And with this, it's like, oh no, we couldn't do that. Oh no, we have to be safer than that. So we get kind of the Beetlejuice minions of the sort of shrunken head guys. And I'm like, why do these guys have name tags? They don't need names. These are just generic like afterlife henchmen. I don't need a backstory. I don't need to know who Bob is. It's fine. I don't need that, like it's like there are so many more creative ways we could do this, but it just feels like they were like, yeah, we could sell some toys of these guys. These guys could be the new minions. And it's like, oh no, like that's not what this is supposed to be.
Yeah, there was such a feast in the first movie of like the visuals in the world, but also like the people in the world, and the waiting room is like a perfect example of like where you just get like such a cast of characters across the full spectrum. And I think that they could have done some of that in the whole Soul Train sequence, but a lot of the people in the environment, the surroundings, I'm like looking around, I'm like, this is, they could do a little something more fun, and I think here's my second Star Wars reference of this episode, but in Star Wars, like when you go into the cantina, that's that place of like all kinds of strange looking creatures from all kinds of different planets, and it shows this kind of diverse spectrum of like all the possibilities, and there's just, you just follow our character walking through there. It's just fun, it's just fun to explore and like see all these like wild looking things, and what they do and how they interact with each other and what their voices are like. And we didn't have that like same sense of like awe and wonder of this afterlife middling world in this movie. And so I thought, I was hoping that the Soul Train bit could have done some of that, because there's just so many people, and there's a lot of fun like ways that they're dancing and interacting with each other. But I think that sequence is just, it's okay, it's all right.
Yeah, the Soul Train sequence, that's such a good point, because it's like, that is essentially like the cantina scene is what makes Star Wars feel like a lived in world, where it's like, these people are all just here. We don't need to like have like, and this guy whose backstory is this, and this guy, it's like, it doesn't matter. It's just, you walk into a bar in Star Wars and this is what it's like, and I think that's what the waiting room scene was in the original Beetlejuice, where it's like, you go in the waiting room and it's just like, yeah, all these people that are dead that are trying to, solve a problem, and they got to wait in line and take a number, and it's like being at the DMV, but you're dead and it could be forever. Like, and then I think that Soul Train sequence, it's true, that was a great opportunity where they could have given us, these people that died in really creative ways, but instead it's just sort of like, and look, disco dancers, but they're dead. And I feel like they repeated that Soul Train joke so many times. I told one of my friends that it's like the equivalent of when someone at your office says something funny in a meeting, and then all week they just keep repeating the punchline, and you're like, yup. That was pretty funny when you said that in that meeting. Got it. Yep. Okay. Like, it's just like, okay. I felt like the Soul Train joke just was the punchline in the meeting that we're just going to keep hearing over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I rolled my eyes every time that they said Soul Train. I was just like, oh no, like, why are we doing this again? Like, the first film was so smart. It was so creative in its choices. And I mean, just the waiting room and the you have to take a number, and the number is huge, and you're never going to see anybody, and the caseworker, and like all of these things were so smart. And it's so funny because it's so relatable, as opposed to trying to just shoehorn Soul Train in there.
Yeah.
When it doesn't relate to anything else. So I almost wish that they would have explored immigration a little bit more, and kind of recreated that waiting room feel in those immigration lines. Because I mean, we've all waited in lines, and we know how much that sucks. And you get up to the window and you don't have the right thing, so you have to go talk to somebody else, and then you have to wait forever again. Like, there's so many things that they could have done with that, and really like drawn those scenes out to make them fun and engaging and all of that. But instead we get Soul Train 17 times.
Yeah, there's so much humor to be had in the bureaucracy of the afterlife. And it's like crazy that they're just like, but look, visual gag, because it's the Soul Train, because Soul Train, get it? Because Soul Train, right? Get it? And you're like, yep, we got it. Versus like, I think about in the first movie, there's the football team that's in the caseworker's office.
Yes.
And at one point, one of the guys says, hey, coach, where's the men's room? And she's sitting there and she's like, men's room, get out of here. Like, that's such a more clever joke than like, look, it's the Soul Train. It's like a ghost asking her where the men's room is. And she's like, men's room, will you get out of here? Like, that's great. That's so much funnier. And I just can't believe that, like, it's like it does. It feels so much smarter and sharper. And this feels so much more like, well, what would be the lowest hanging fruit? And that's what we're going to go for.
Which is why I'm glad that our theaters didn't laugh out loud, because that would be sad. Because see, we all know this is fine. It's not funny. It's just fine. You get like a little different breath for a moment where you're like, yeah, there you go. I get it. It's like funny for half a second, but the the waiting room piece is also funny because it hits on some truth that like we've all experienced, like a universal truth that's like shared experience as human beings. That's really funny, which is like a lot of comedy. And Soul Train just kind of like a like wordplay a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so then you're like, I get it. And then there's not more that you can like build on top of that. Whereas that waiting room, bureaucracy, waiting in general, having to do with these like logistical administrative things, that is like a continuous like series of jokes that you can build on in different scenarios, different characters, how they deal with the frustrations of it. And so the buildability of the Soul Train joke is also just missing. So that's, I also think, why it falls flat, because you just once they show people dancing to like funk and groove, then the joke's over, right? Like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's not more that you can go off of that.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's kind of like it's like a pun where you're like, yep, all right, got it, you know. And then there's not, it's true, it's like there's no other direction other than, and this is the punchline. The end.
I'm curious your thoughts on the baby Beetlejuice bits.
I honestly, it's so funny because I feel like sort of similar to the dog in Deadpool Wolverine. It's like, yep, we put this little thing in. It's again feels like we're going for a toy. We're going for, you know, something that's easy and marketable, which I don't feel like the first movie at any point was like, yes, can't you picture the toys now? It was like, it was just trying to be a funny movie that was creative. And this feels like you can see the like, well, you know what we need? A cute little baby Beetlejuice, because baby Yoda, you know, like, and you know what we need? We need minions. You know what we need? We need this thing that we can kind of like put on a product or, you know, use in a commercial. And it just, I don't know, it just like, okay, whatever, baby Beetlejuice, it's giving Chucky, it's giving whatever, like, okay, what great. But it just felt so, yet one more super unnecessary thing to have in here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the other thing that just bothered me is like, why are we doing this? There's no point. And we get to see baby Beetlejuice twice, and neither time was necessary. I was like, why are we doing this? I am uncomfortable. I don't like this. Can we stop?
Yeah.
So it's not even this like, oh my gosh, it's so cute, so I'm willing to watch it even if it's unnecessary. It was just like, okay, this is unnecessary and I don't like this. So can we move on?
Yes, for sure. It's just another sort of repeated like gag that you're like, it didn't really work for me the first time. We don't need to revisit it.
Yeah, and it kind of is, it's what ends the movie too, which is fascinating. I mean, that whole scene was like really uncomfy, honestly. Like, I'm uncomfortable, and also playing it back, you're like, wait, how did this make sense? I don't know. Yeah. The like, I don't know the logistics plot points of like what happened earlier. It's weird. It's weird. It's so weird. But also, I was like, if you're gonna do Baby Beetlejuice, have that be the central like sparring between Beetlejuice and his little baby version that's like unhinged, and then he's trying to have to figure out like how baby Beetlejuice is wreaking havoc. Like play it up, or just don't include it at all, because I think this like weird mixed version of like, we're going to show it a couple of times, maybe it's played for a gag in this final like ending denouement scene of Astrid giving, like, it's so strange.
It feels like that's where they were trying to be like, look, we're a little bit edgy. And it's like, oh, but this is like misplaced edgy, you know, like there's 100 opportunities where they could have gone for like a smarter way to do something. And instead they just go like lowest common denominator. And then it feels like they're like, oh no, we're making a Beetlejuice movie. We got to have something a little bit edgy in here. How about this? And it's like, what? You know, like there's so many just sort of ideas where you just don't get like why that's in there in this movie. And I think that's what's so frustrating is the first movie feels like everything has like there's an intention for everything, because it feels like kind of a singular vision. And this feels like there's an intention for everything, but the intention is like, well, this will get a laugh out of the 18 to 34 demographic, and this will get a laugh out of, you know, parents in the audience, and this will get a laugh out of teenage kids, and this, you know, it's like there, you can feel the kind of like audience demographics in each joke versus just doing a joke because it's a funny joke.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we've been saying of like the sequel feels very disjointed, and it's I don't know, it's a movie by committee, and it's not very cohesive together. And so it does feel like all of these people had all of these different ideas and they were just like, oh yeah, throw it in. That's great.
Yeah.
Do we need to connect it in a way that's logical? No, that's fine. Just throw it in.
Yep.
We're good.
Exactly. I think that's what's like, I think I was cautiously optimistic for this when they announced it because Tim Burton was back. And I was like, okay, we got Keaton, we got Tim Burton, we got Winona Ryder, like we got, Catherine O'Hara, we got like a lot of the original people. So maybe this will have the same vibe. And it's like almost more disappointing to see this feel so sort of like, oh, this is corporate product. Like in my review for Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, I said it's like cinematic mac and cheese. And this feels like Frozen Empire in that sense, where it's like, well, kids like mac and cheese, and mac and cheese is a nice generic meal, but it's not, you don't want to eat mac and cheese every day, especially when you previously had something that was way better than mac and cheese. And I think this ends up feeling like that sad corporate mac and cheese where you're like, no, I don't want the cinematic mac and cheese. I want like the unique thing. I want something different. I want to feel like a chef made this. I don't want to feel like it just got like cranked out of like a fast food restaurant.
I'm dying. Cinematic mac and cheese. We need to trademark this right now. That is so good. That's iconic.
Thank you.
It's too good.
It's just that kind of thing where you're like, yeah, this is fine, but I don't want this every day. It's that kind of like nostalgia of like, remember when you were a kid and you ate mac and cheese and you loved it? Well, now every, movie that cost over a certain amount of money is just going to feed you a giant bowl of mac and cheese, whether you want it or you don't.
And it's and you're like making it and looking at the box, you're like, oh my God, this is going to be great. But then you actually start eating, you're like, I don't feel so good.
Yeah. And then you realize like I was 11. Of course I liked this back then.
Yeah. And that kind of assembly line, like it was manufactured and made in large batches. And yeah.
Totally.
Okay. Any other big thoughts about Beetlejuice? Big things that we wanted to hit on before we wrap?
I just think it's funny that like in our conversation, we've come up with like 10 better ideas for how this movie could have been. Like just in this conversation, we're like, what they could have done was this. And what might have been a better story was this. And it's like, why didn't they have any of these ideas? And the only thing I can think is that it was just like, there's money riding on this. This is a studio thing. We've got to hit certain, demographics. We've got to please certain audiences. And it's like, we just thought of like 7 more creative ways that you could have done this story.
And it really begs the question of like, what was the writing and production and like review process like? Because oftentimes those films that like weren't meant to be big hits are the ones that end up being beloved because they're so true to themselves and true to the vision, right? And like somehow it magically got made and then all of a sudden like there's this really loyal following because it's like unapologetically itself, and this one's you're like, you can feel it bumping up and like molded by multiple pressures and voices and pillars that need to be hit or blah 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 for marketing. And I think the end product on the end of the assembly line is basically something that is maybe like palatable is the right word, like palatable to a lot of people, but maybe not beloved by any.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's kind of like before movie theaters were kind of dying and the streaming era and all these things, it was like people would go see a movie like Beetlejuice. People would go see a movie like Pee-wee's Big Adventure or whatever, like you just went to the movie theater and saw a movie. But now it's like, there's so many different distractions. There's so many things that are keeping people from going to a movie theater that every movie has to hit every possible demographic. And it just makes it where movies feel so boring now because nothing really is willing to take a risk anymore.
Yeah. And I think there's the added pressure with it being a sequel of a beloved first film. Totally. Like I think Space Jam is another good example of this. It's just like the pressure is so high, but then you also have so many expectations to figure out how to fulfill. But also you want to do something that's like fresh and new to this world, but then also you can't. How do you do both? You know, it's like it's an impossible task. I do not envy any creative writer, director that's figuring out how to write a sequel to a beloved first film, like especially at that like 20, 30 years later when a generation has passed. And you know, like that's hard stuff. But it's almost just like don't make that movie.
Yeah, it's like maybe we could just make a different thing.
Yeah, exactly. We don't need another Space Jam. We don't need another Beetlejuice. It's okay.
Yeah. Maybe everything doesn't have to be pre-existing IP and we could just make a new creative idea like how the original movie was. But it's like, oh, we can't do that anymore because it's not the 80s. So
yes. Yeah.
So speaking of distractions in the theater, I really would like to take a brief detour and give a shout out to the man in my theater Monday at 10 a.m. to see Beetlejuice. He was sitting in the row in front of me, and he appeared to not be enjoying this movie because he was on his phone the entire time. He's like a 40-something-year-old man on his phone the whole time. Brightness all the way up, not on dark mode, right in front of me. And it appeared because there were certain times, like when the Soul Train stuff was going on, I was like, I don't care about this. I got the joke that I'm trying to like peer over and like see what's going on. I think he was like on a dating app is my guess, and is like messaging his matches. That is my best guess as to what was happening at 9 a.m. or at 10 a.m. Monday morning in my screening of Beetlejuice. And so I just want to give a shout out to that gentleman. I hope that he had a lovely conversation with whoever he was messaging.
It's like, I really hope it works out for you, you know?
Typing up sweet nothings to the backdrop of Beetlejuice.
During Beetlejuice. It's a really romantic movie, you know?
It's truly inspired.
Oh my God. The theater behavior is so strange now because I don't get why you would pay money for tickets to a movie if you have no intention on engaging with that movie. Like you're going to spend like $25 to just sit in a dark room and text. You could just text like at your house. You don't have to pay money for that. You can just like sit in like your bathroom and text if you want to, you know? I think that's such a the movie theater behavior now is the weirdest thing to me. And I'm lucky because I get to go to a lot of press screenings where people are like focused on the movie. But every time I go to just like, oh yeah, I'm going to just go see this movie, I'm always amazed by like people just straight up like watching TikTok during the movie. And I'm like, you're in a movie theater. The whole agreement here is that you just turn your phone off and pay attention. If you don't want to, you just like don't have to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially the full brightness screens. That one really gets me. I'm like, if you go watch, turn it all the way down. Be as discreet as you can.
Unhinged behavior from theater audiences these days.
Yeah.
Never a dull moment. You know, if you're not enjoying what's on the screen, there's usually an opportunity to look at somebody doing something ridiculous. Exactly. So at least there's that.
You get your own little show going on.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I have a love-hate relationship with the talkers in the theaters because if they've got great commentary, I'm like, talk away. You're going to make this add to the experience for me. But if I don't like your ideas, just shh. Let's just not.
Totally.
Not. But you always get the like older person that's like got like the sassiest commentary, and it's sometimes really entertaining. So
for sure. The worst is when you get the person who will like explain something really obvious, like somebody being like, you know, that's Danny DeVito.
Yeah.
He's been in Tim Burton movies before. Like, yeah, we all know who Danny DeVito is. Yeah, we got it. You know?
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. All right. Well, this was our review/roast of Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. Rewrite. Roast, review, rewrite. You can find it available out in theaters. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. And a big thank you to Alexis for joining us and sharing all of your thoughts and opinions about this one. Where can people find more of you and your opinions on the internet?
Well, I am available. I am Trashwire on TikTok. I am Alexis Gentry and Trashwire on Instagram. You can also just find my stuff at trashwire.com. I recently resurrected my podcast, What You Watchin', so that's available on different podcast platforms and on YouTube. And yeah, you can just, I'm also on Threads and Blue Sky, so if I have a movie opinion and you want to engage with me in movie discussion, I'm usually in those places talking about movies as well.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, we'll definitely include all of those links and handles, all those goodness in the show notes. It's always great. Especially those 90 seconds or less pieces of content. I'm always like, if I don't know if I should watch a movie or not, let me just watch Alexis and then I will figure out if I should watch this or not. So it's really, really awesome content.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, our name, Movies and Us, sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. So everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating or review, letting us know your thoughts about Beetlejuice Beetlejuice. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Movies and Us Pod, or you can email us at moviesanduspod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to discuss the film The Fall Guy. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you again real soon.